Hello. This is what I attempt to propose to be a audiobook recording of Training in Christianity by Soren Kierkegaard. It is translated by Walter Lowry, and my particular copy, and the one you see before you, was reprinted in 1944. I've been reading this, but the version is online on the Internet Library and available for you to see. For Soren Kierkegaard often speaks in rather an animated manner, which makes it difficult to follow him if you have not the text in front of you. So without further ado, I shall begin with the general introduction by the translator. A book of mine on Kierkegaard, a very big book, which was published in 1938 by the Oxford University Press, contains two chapters, Back to Christianity and Venturing Far Out, which are specifically an introduction to the works comprised in this volume, and a far more adequate introduction than I can furnish here. Because my book is big and costly, I cannot assume that it is available to every reader of this translation, and yet the mere fact that it exists justifies me in making this introduction brief. Some time ago, Admiral Mahan fired a shot which was heard around the world when he demonstrated the strategical importance of a fleet in being, wherever it might be located. And here I reflect upon the importance of a book in being. It has been pointed out in the preface that the 6 works comprised in this and the companion volume, and 5 more of like character which are not comprised in it, belong in a distinctive period in Soren Kierkegaard's life, which began with the Easter experience of 1848, and that the writings of this period differ from all that went before, not only because of the concentration upon Christian themes, but also because of the directness of speech. The pseudonyms, which were so characteristic of the method of indirect communication, were all but abandoned, essentially abandoned. The continuity of these later works with the earlier production can be most clearly traced in the religious discourses, which were never pseudonymous, and which accompanied the pseudonymous works from the very beginning. In them we can mark a gradual development from what is called in the postscript religion A, religion in the sphere of immanence, to religion B, religion in the sphere of transcendence. That is, to the distinctively Christian categories. It will be noted that all the works in this volume formally resemble the discourses in the fact that they are based upon scriptural texts, but it is evident enough that they are not sermons which could be delivered, or were designed for delivery, not even 3 of the 4 which are here called discourses. In another instance, Soren Kierkegaard points to the difference observable in the few discourses which were designed for delivery and actually were delivered. Although the discourses from first to last were published over Soren Kierkegaard's name and undoubtedly reflect his personal beliefs, I have the impression that in the earlier period they regularly lagged behind the religious stage he had actually attained at the moment of writing, whereas in the pseudonymous works he was not restrained by diffidence or modesty from asserting positions somewhat in advance of his positive and secure attainment at the moment. He himself said of the postscript that it represented a deliberation, and he said of all the pseudonymous works that they were his own schooling in Christianity. What he called his authorship, which began with either or and ended with the works he had published, was a movement, a development in a definite direction, away from the aesthetical, away from speculation, back to Christianity. Considering that it was all comprised within the brief period of 8 years, it was a very rapid movement. He could well say that his position was that of a bird in flight. In the preface to one of his discourses at the Communion, he said, "The movement aptly terminates here, at the foot of the altar." In this volume, we are dealing with the concluding stage. And yet, it must not be supposed that the themes which we encounter here are new. References to thoughts developed in the earlier works are here so frequent that I have not essayed to indicate them in all the footnotes. The pseudonyms, in fact, said the same things, but they said them in so different a way, and, alas, they said so much more, that Soren Kierkegaard finally felt obliged to warn his readers not to ascribe to him anything the pseudonyms had said. This imposes upon us great caution in interpreting Soren Kierkegaard by his earlier works, whereas we can be confident that everything we find in these last works gives exact expression to his thought and faith. They present to us the essential Kierkegaard. This, however, cannot be said of his last productions, the brief and pungent articles which constituted the newspaper and pamphleteering attacks upon the established church. For there, naturally enough, he had little or nothing to say about fundamental Christian doctrines, but concentrated attention upon the abuses which he sought to reform, and for tactical reasons, as he confesses, he did not scruple to employ exaggeration. True as it is that Soren Kierkegaard's interest at this time was concentrated upon the most decisive Christian categories, there is one publication which stands out as a marked exception. It is entitled The Crisis and a Crisis in the Life of an Actress, and it was an aesthetic appraisement of a distinguished actress. It gave pleasure in high circles, for she had become the wife of J.L. Heiberg, the arbiter of literary taste in Denmark. Although Soren Kierkegaard's conscience pricked him terribly for publishing a work so out of keeping with the interests which absorbed him at the time, he was glad later to be able to point to it as a proof that he was not an author who had become religious only when advancing age had dulled his aesthetic sensibility. No sooner had Soren Kierkegaard acquired the freedom to speak out than he felt the necessity of speaking out about himself, with the aim of throwing light upon the earlier writings which he had perversely involved in so much mystification. This resulted in the point of view for my work as an author. Though it is not complete enough to be called a biography, it is the most exquisitely biographical thing he wrote outside of his journal. He had no difficulty in writing it, for in the journal he had 100 times more matter than he had use for here. But when it came to publishing, he drew back. He was deterred more especially by the unusual scruple whether a man has the right to let people know how good he is. He finally decided to call this work an accounting, a report to history, and leave it to be published after his death. He eventually published, however, an impersonal extract from it entitled About My Work as an Author. And at this time he had the courage to publish an abstract of The Book on Adler, a book which he had taken the pains to rewrite 3 times without getting to the point of publishing it. This was called 2 Minor Ethico-Religious Treatises, and the subjects discussed were whether a man has the right to let himself be put to death for the truth, and the difference between a genius and an apostle. Nothing could sound less personal than this, and yet these 2 themes were his deepest personal concern. The first of these essays, translated by Mr. Drew, was published after my translation of The Point of View. Neither did he find any trouble in writing Training in Christianity, in the most outspoken terms of rebuke. But when it came to publishing, the difficulty in this case was of a different sort. So far from disclosing to others how good he was, he might seem in this book to require others to be good when he was not, or to claim to be better than he actually was. And he could be sure that his summons back to Christianity and his description of the book as an endeavor to introduce Christianity into Christendom would be resented as an attack upon the established church, and would perhaps preclude the possibility of obtaining a benefice when his dwindling fortune was exhausted. It meant, to use his own figure of speech, venturing far out, like a lonely swimmer who floats above 70,000 fathoms of water, so far out that God can get a hold of him, and there is no possibility of returning to the secure conditions of life on dry land. He had not yet acquired such a degree of heroism. 2 years earlier, he had been fearful about publishing the Works of Love, lest it give offence to Bishop Minster and the others by its implied renunciation of the Lutheran dogma, by faith alone. More recently, he had qualms about publishing The Sickness Unto Death, notwithstanding that its principal offense was treating seriously the Christian doctrine of sin. His reluctance was finally overcome when he was smarting under an affront that he had received from Minster. Now let him have it, he said to himself, as he handed the manuscript to the printer. It was ascribed the pseudonym Anticlimacus, but it was so far from being pseudonymous that he sent a copy, as he was accustomed to do with all his works, to the bishop, and he was thankful that no complaint was made of it. But training in Christianity presented a far more serious case. In spite of the moral and the preface, it was clearly enough an attack upon established Christendom. The open attack of 1855, in the midst of which Kierkegaard died, contained nothing substantially new, nothing that had not been at least adumbrated in this book. No wonder then that the debate about publishing it was long and agonizing. At the point when he had decided to publish it, Chancellor Olsen, father of his once-young fiancée, died. That was a new complication, for the death of this irreconcilable enemy suggested the possibility of a friendly rapprochement to Regina, who was then happily married, and such a book as this might blast the hope. On the night when he received the news, and was thrown by it into an agony of indecision, the debate was decided by an auditory hallucination in which contending voices were distinctly heard, but hardly understood. Kierkegaard was enough of a psychologist to ascribe both voices to his subliminal self. Yet the experience was so terrible that it decided him to publish. Although this book was written with the intention of publishing it over his own name, it was ascribed to Anticlimacus, with the name of Soren Kierkegaard on the title page as editor. There is something childish in the glee he felt in the discovery of the pseudonym Anticlimacus. It seemed to him to resolve the difficulty, although no one was left in the least doubt who the author was. The new pseudonym was reminiscent of Johannes Climacus, the reputed author of the scraps and the postscripts, who was exceptionally competent to expound what Christianity is, but confessed himself that he was not a Christian. Anticlimacus, as the name implies, is the exact opposite of this. He is a Christian in a superlative degree, to a degree Kierkegaard thought almost repulsive, almost demoniacal. In 1848, before he had written For Self-Examination and Judge for Yourselves, Kierkegaard thought of publishing The Sickness Unto Death and Training in Christianity in one volume, which was to have as its title The Collected Works of Completion, or, as he thought later, of Consummation. He hesitated between these two works, Fundelsen and Fullbringelsen, because each emphasized in a different way the thought he wished to express. The former suggested more clearly that this was the end of his work as an author, the latter that these last works were the consummation of his whole effort. At that time, he proposed as a subtitle, An Endeavor to Introduce Christianity into Christendom. By way of atoning for so presumptuous a statement, he proposed to print at the bottom of the page a poetical endeavor without authority. Without authority was Soren Kierkegaard's category as a writer. He would persuade by the truth alone. He was neither a parson nor a professor. In all his works, and not only in the work which in this volume is so entitled, he virtually said to the reader, "Judge for yourself." This title expressed the feeling that he himself was only a very ordinary sort of Christian. For the reader of today, the pathos of the work lies in the fact that he actually became such a Christian as he here depicts, a Christian who stood ready to sacrifice everything for Christ, and did in fact die in performing the task he believed was laid upon him. So the book was published, and strange as it may seem, it made hardly any impression. The public were not prepared to believe that the author of either or was a serious man. And strange as it may seem, Kierkegaard was glad that it made no impression, that it was neither denounced by the ecclesiastical authorities nor criticized by the religious press. Later, he expressed the opinion that it ought to have been publicly denounced, or else accepted and acted upon. But for the moment he was grateful for the respite, for at least a temporary exemption from the necessity of opening a sharp attack. The fact, however, that so strong a rebuke produced so little impression must have made him aware that the attack, when it had to come, must be in the face of such deafness of hearing, be as loud and shrill and piercing as it actually was 5 years later. It might, I should think, make us aware also that a less violent reproach of existent evils in Christendom had no chance to be heard. If the attack had to come, for in the preface and the moral, this book held out an olive branch, an invitation to the Church to make, through the constituted authorities, and more particularly through Bishop Minster as primate, a formal admission that the Christianity it exemplified was not true Christianity, but a compromise with the world. Kierkegaard naively hoped for such an admission, for he thought it must be apparent that the Church could justify itself in no other way. But one man there was who understood this book, and understood it as an attack upon the establishment, which, as Kierkegaard said, he deified. That man was Bishop Minster. His son-in-law, Pastor Paoli, reported to Kierkegaard, "The bishop is very angry." His words were these, as soon as he came into the sitting room the first day after receiving the book from Kierkegaard. "The book has greatly embittered me. It is a profane game played with holy things." He charged Paoli to report this to Kierkegaard, and "let him come up here at once to visit me, and I shall tell him that myself." Thereupon Kierkegaard remarked in his journal, "He has practically given the book its passport, and me with it." Nevertheless, as the journal reports, the following morning I went to him. I began at once in this wise: "Today I have come on a particular business. Pastor Paoli told me yesterday that you have a mind to see me at once and to reprimand me for my last book. I beg you to regard it as a new expression of the deference I have always shown you, that as soon as I am informed of this, I instantly make my appearance." He replied, "No, I have no right to reprimand you. I have told you before that I have no objection to every bird singing with its own beak." Then he added, "People are free to say what they will about me." I begged him to tell me if I had in any way offended him by publishing such a book. Then he answered, "Yes, I really believe it will not do any good." With this reply I was contented. It was kindly and personal. There was nothing remarkable about the rest of the conversation, except that at the beginning he said, "Yes, one half of the book is an attack upon Martensen, and the other half on me," and later we talked about a passage in the Reflections which he considered coined for him. We are appraised by this that Kierkegaard was not vainly beating the air, that the corruptions of Christian thought he so vehemently attacked were common in Christendom and were exemplified by the two most influential religious leaders in Denmark, and that so religious a man as Minster was greatly embittered by a book which, if it is bitter to us, is bitter only because it stresses so insistently the most decisive Christian categories. Training in Christianity, written for the most part in 1848, was not published until September 27th, 1850. But when his next book, For Self-Examination, was finished, Kierkegaard seems to have felt no difficulty about publishing it promptly, and it appeared on September 10th, 1851, over his own name, without the fiction of a pseudonym. In the meantime, the breach with Minster had widened, so that he felt less distress at offending him. Moreover, he had acquired boldness to venture farther out. This book is as decisively Christian as its predecessor, and for that reason just as exasperating, although it is not so polemical against anyone or anything in particular, only infinitely polemical, as Kierkegaard had said on one occasion. Judge for Yourselves was written shortly after this, with the evident intent of publishing it immediately, for the subtitle, For Self-Examination Recommended to the Sage, expressly recalls the title of the previous work, and it is designated, moreover, as a second series. There is no record of any debate or any hesitancy about publishing it, and yet it was not published in Soren Kierkegaard's lifetime. In fact, it was not published until 21 years after his death, having been held back by the grim hostility of his brother, Bishop Peter Kierkegaard, who had possession of his papers and was doubtless of Minster's opinion that such a book will not do any good. The story is a pitiful one, and yet it shows that, as between that age and this, there is a difference which is not altogether to our disadvantage. For if we are no better, at least we are not so unwilling to be told that we are bad. Why Kierkegaard himself did not publish it remains something of a mystery. As I am not a professor, I need not pretend to see more deeply into the millstone than others. I suspect that the tone of it may have seemed too strong for the period which preceded the open attack, which he was both impatient and reluctant to begin, and that when he was in the midst of the conflict, the tone seemed not strong enough. Yet in the midst of the conflict, Training in Christianity appeared in a second edition, which still contained in the preface, thrice repeated, and the moral. But in the newspaper broadside which appeared at the same time, Kierkegaard formally withdrew them. He explained that the book was republished in its original form because he regarded it as a historical document, but that if it were being published now for the first time, it would have been altered in the following particulars. It would not have been by a pseudonym, but by me, and the preface thrice repeated would have been omitted, and consequently also the moral to part 1. This retraction concerns me personally, for I find comfort in the preface and the moral. Soren Kierkegaard explains in this context that in the preface and the moral he had treated grace as if it were available not only for the forgiveness of sins past, but also as a sort of dispensation from the actual following of Christ and the actual exertion of being a Christian. I think he puts the case against himself too strongly. I would say rather that the preface and the moral, which offer the grace I am so much needed, might too easily be twisted into an indulgence or dispensation. This means, as Kierkegaard often affirmed, that it is so frightfully easy to fool God. Of all Kierkegaard's works, those composed between 1848 and 1852 seem to me the most likely to do good, Bishop Minster's opinion to the contrary notwithstanding. They are free from the exaggeration which mars for us the effect of his pamphleteering attack, however necessary it might have been at its time. And they represent the real Kierkegaard more truly than do any of the pseudonymous works, even if they do not represent him so completely, with the poetical and humorous embellishments which make the earlier works so delightful. At all events, they do good to me, and I hope that some individual reader may find them as profitable. It seems as if they were written expressly for me, yet I know that they were not written for me exclusively, but for that individual, whoever he may be. Walter Lowry.